I am truly honored to have on Rear View Ahead Mr. Wesley Lowery. Mr. Lowery is a CBS News correspondent. He reported extensively on the ground during several of the biggest stories of 2020, including the police killings of George Floyd, Jacob Blake, as well as COVID-19's disproportionate impact on Black Americans. He worked at the Washington Post, where he became one of the country's foremost journalists on race, law enforcement, and justice. Mr. Lowery won a Pulitzer Prize for his work on the Post series Fatal Force Project, and he is a published author. His reporting and writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, They They Can't Kill Us All, the story of the struggle for Black lives. Thank you so much, Mr. Lowery, for joining us.
Of course, really happy to be here with you.
I really wanted to have a conversation with you because I reread your book just a couple of weeks ago, and rereading your book in the wake of the verdict was quite powerful. There are these moments where I think about the issue of hope that people had, particularly around after Ferguson, that there will be this rallying cry of young people, young activists. There will be a change, and there has been a new awakening, one might argue, after the killing of George Floyd. I wanted to get your thoughts about the verdict and what you make of this moment in our history.
Certainly. I think that we know, and it's clear, that George Floyd's death was a major moment in this conversation. It's conversation not just about race and policing, but this conversation about race in America and about the persistent inequalities and inequities that still exist in our society 400 years after the first Africans arrived. And so we've lived through what has been quite a historical moment, something that matters. And, having watched the trial, I was not necessarily surprised by the outcome in that the prosecution put on a pretty overwhelming case. Keith Ellison, the Attorney General in Minnesota, gave an interview afterwards saying that they wanted to try the case as if they had no video. And so when you saw the number of witnesses they called, the medical testimony, they really did that. And so having watched all of it, it seemed clear that on the objective merits, there was grounds or at least enough evidence to support a conviction. But what we know is that the electorate, the people who make up jury pools, are typically very hesitant to convict a police officer, and that all it takes is one juror, one person who holds out and says, I refuse to convict a police officer, and you end up with either a mistrial or you end up with him being acquitted. And so it was one of those things where you watch it and you think the prosecution has proven their case here, but you can never be too sure. And so I guess I was, in seeing the actual conviction itself, I thought that it seemed just, it seemed like the right legal decision. But that said, it's one case that is an anecdote that sits within the context of a bigger system and a bigger conversation. And so I do think sometimes we can invest too much into individual cases. That justice for George Floyd doesn't mean justice for Breonna Taylor or for Ahmaud Arbery or for anyone else. And so I think that on the one hand, it seems like a lot of people's worst fear that even in this particularly egregious case caught on video, there would not be justice. That has not come true. But I still do think there's a lot of work to be
done. I agree with you, that feeling of, after the verdict, a feeling of yes, and now what? A feeling of this is an achievement in terms of part of the justice system, but what does this mean for all the cases that happened that particular week, all the incidents that happened that particular week? And I just wanted to read something that really stood out to me in your book, and this is a comment from Brittany Patnick, and she says, "We have no choice but to keep going. If one of the central demands of the movement is to stop killing us, and they're still killing us, then we don't get to stop either. So the movement continues. Do you see this movement, this racial awakening, many people talked about over the summer, still continuing in many ways?
Oh, certainly. I definitely think the conversation is still going on. What we also know through the work that my colleagues at the Washington Post and others have done is we know that police killings continue. That 3 people are shot and killed by the police every single day. That's been every day since George Floyd was killed, every day since Derek Chauvin was convicted. That when we're talking about race and criminal justice, there's still a massive system in place that has largely been unreformed and largely unchanged. And so this push and pull, I don't see that going anywhere anytime soon.
When there was one interesting point you made about the 2016 election, and your book was written at the time of the election, and it was really powerful to think about that election and where we are now. This is what Kayla Reed says. There isn't going to be a single bill passed that will suddenly encompass all what needs to be done in terms of marginalized Black and Brown people. You've got to redo the whole damn thing. I'm just wondering about your hope for legislation to deal with some of these issues.
So what's really interesting is when we think about policing in America and the criminal justice system in America, we have to think about what this system actually looks like. In the United States of America, we have 18,000 police departments. They largely operate by their own policies, their own rules. They report back to themselves. These are independent militias, more or less. And so what ends up happening is when you get a change somewhere, it doesn't necessarily ensure that change plays out across the entire country. Beyond that, though,
right,
the federal government only has limited power in its oversight of local policing. This is not something where you can snap your fingers and with legislation change the entire system. That's just not the way it's set up currently. Could that be changed? Sure, but that is the way it currently looks. I mean, even when you look at the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which has been one of the big focuses in Washington of late, and there's kind of conversation about whether or not something like that might be done on a bipartisan basis, there's nothing in that piece of legislation that would have prevented George Floyd from being killed. Even when we see proposed legislation around policing, it very rarely actually addresses the incident itself that prompted the legislation. And so, like I said, you passing the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which you can debate on its merits. There are a lot of things that activists and others want that are in that bill. I'm not saying write it off or it doesn't matter or wouldn't do anything, but even passing that would not prevent another George Floyd tomorrow. And so I think that, sometimes I think in Washington, where I live, and I've covered politics before, there's this desire for the narrative of like the bad thing happened, then we all work together and we change the law, and now the bad thing can never happen again. In this space, there's nothing being debated currently by any legislative body that would prevent the next George Floyd from happening, which means that when the next George Floyd happens, people will be in the streets, we'll be having the conversations again, and we'll be exploring the next thing. The momentum of this movement is in so many ways driven by the fact that the problem remains unsolved.
I've had an opportunity to work in newspapers in Washington, D.C., in New York, and in Boston. I was just wondering, in your observations about sort of the culture and climate of these cities as it relates to race relations, what has been your observation? And I ask that as a person working in Boston and living in Boston for the past 20 years, and there's a lot of conversation about Boston and the reputation that we have as it relates to racism. And I just wanted your observation as a person working in the city for a while, what your thoughts were.
So look, I really enjoyed Boston. It was one of the first places I worked, and so it was one of the first cities I got to know as a reporter. And when you're a reporter, you get to know a city a little differently. You know the elected officials, you're in all the different neighborhoods and communities. You sometimes get the type of education and introduction to a city in a year that it might take another resident 10 years or something like that, because you're in it in a way that's a little different. I really enjoyed Boston. One of the things, though, is that there are multiple Bostons, right? There's not just one Boston. And I think that a lot of people, when they think of Boston, aren't ever thinking about Roxbury or Mattapan or Dorchester. They're not thinking about the 250,000 Black and brown people in Boston. They're not thinking about the whole communities where if you don't speak Cape Verdean, you can't figure out where anything is, right?
Right.
They're thinking about a very specific set of Boston. And I think in some ways that speaks to the limitations and the frustrations, right? That you have this remarkably majority minority city, is a remarkable city with such a rich history. And the way people perceive of it, the identity of Boston is defined by just a handful of small neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods happen to be white. And so, look, I think Boston, like any other city, has its history, it has its present, it has its current struggles, it has its inequities. And Boston's a city that has some stark ones when you look at the numbers and the data. But like I said, my experiences in Boston weren't much unlike other places I've lived. The history of LA and the present of LA look a little different than Boston, but I can find you some not great things. Same thing here in the District of Columbia, same thing in my hometown of Cleveland where I grew up, and so like I said, I think that I think everyone gets defensive when their own hometown's getting talked about, but it can be, the thing about it is when you look in the mirror, when I looked in the mirror this morning and I wasn't so happy seeing the weight I put on during COVID, I can't really get mad at the mirror. and I think sometimes around issues of race, what we have is people getting mad at the mirror. The mirror must be lying to me, and I certainly think that dynamic can be present when people talk about Boston and race.
I grew up in New York City in the 1980s and 1990s, and it was really talk about race relations and the tension in the city at that time. And so I think of New York as being a city, in terms of my own growing up, as being a racially charged city. I just wanted to talk a little bit about your background. And the last time you had a chance to meet was in Boston when you were receiving an award from the National Association of Black Journalists. And it was shortly, I believe, after you had received your Pulitzer Prize. Just tell me about sort of your journey as a journalist and how you came to get into this profession and how you think it has shaped you in terms of your identity.
Sure. I think that I was really lucky. I was really blessed that I always knew this is what I wanted to do. I worked for my middle school newspaper, my high school newspaper, my college newspaper. I'm not particularly good at many other things, and so I didn't have a lot of choices. But it was funny because my greatest aspirations when I was in middle school or high school was maybe one day I'd get to be a columnist at Cleveland Plain Dealer at my hometown paper. I was not someone who set out to do any of the things I've done. My career could end tomorrow, and I've done much more than I ever imagined I'd get the opportunity to do. And that, in a lot of ways, is very humbling, and it's something that I don't take lightly or take for granted. It's one of the reasons it's really important to me to spend a lot of my time, maybe even too much of my time, working with journalism organizations, working with students, mentoring folks, because I just don't ever want to take for granted the amazing opportunities I've been given. Because I wanted to do this so young, I was kind of a nerd and a student of journalism. I was reading the news, like the journalism trade magazines in high school and middle school, and learning a lot about this profession and thinking a lot about this profession. And so because of that in college, I knew it was going to be really important for me to get internships. And so I did an internship every single summer in college. Some of them were unpaid, so I was working a whole other job on top of it to make sure I could get this experience. But journalism is, in a lot of ways, a trade. I liken it to fixing cars, right? It's a trade in that there's a YouTube video that can tell you how to do it, right? You follow these 7 steps, and you end up with an article, right? But when you do it, you learn how to break the rules. Well, this type of car is actually a little bit different, so we're going to do it this way. Or, that your first oil change, you could follow the YouTube video. Your 100th, you could write a whole new YouTube video about the real way to do it. Writing, reporting, interviewing are those same types of skills. Your 1,000th interview is always going to be better than your first. Your 1,000,000th article is always going to be better than your 100th, right? And so much of it's about putting those repetitions in so that you learn those rules like the back of your hand, so that you have a situational awareness and understanding. And so I've just really spent a lot of years trying to do as much journalism as possible, do as many interviews, talking to as many folks, writing as much as I can, trying different types of journalism, audio journalism, on camera work, feature writing versus investigative writing versus breaking news, and just trying to kind of get those repetitions in. It's like being a basketball player and going to the free throw line, and you spend all summer at that line putting in those reps so that come game time, you can do what you need to do. And so for me, I don't ever want to be put in a position where there's an amazing story in front of me and I don't have the tools to tell it. Right. And so that I think has been something I focused on a lot, something I think about a lot. and it has just been kind of a big part of my journey. And so I, ended up right after college, I interned at the Boston Globe, then I went out to the LA Times for 6 months, and I got hired back at the Boston Globe. So I did Boston twice, actually. Spent about a year, maybe a little bit more than a year in Boston, where was involved the coverage of the Boston Marathon bombings and Aaron Hernandez and the mayor's race to replace Tom Menino at the time, in which Marty Walsh got elected, and the Senate race in which Ed Markey was initially elected. And after that, went off to the Washington Post to cover Congress, and happened to have my bag packed when Ferguson happened. It was actually days after you and I met that first time in 2014, and ended up spending the next however many years now it's been as kind of one of the leading reporters on issues of race and justice and policing.
In covering these really tough stories, I guess I'm wondering about, do you remain hopeful about the future as it relates to tackling these issues of race in America?
Yes and no. And the reason I say that is that I don't necessarily have a rose-colored glasses hope. I think these issues remain very pervasive. I think our conversations around them remain very defensive and often counterproductive. I think that these conversations require a level of humility from an empowered and often privileged majority, and it isn't always willing to grant that. I think that the way we teach our own history puts us at a disadvantage, in part because of how limited we are in how we teach our own history, all the things we do not know about our own country, even those of us who care about these things and seek them out, that there's been a centuries long conspiracy to prevent us from knowing what's actually happened in our own country. But what I'll say is that we've got more people are more empowered to tell their own stories, to find that history, to agitate for bigger and more sweeping kinds of change today than they have been ever before. And the only time we do more is tomorrow and the day after that, right? And so, look, would I love to say that by the time I have kids or grandkids, we will have solved all these problems, and I would love for that to be true. I know that my children and grandchildren will be engaged in a struggle for justice and equality, the same way that my grandparents knew that of me. Now, the hope is that that struggle looks different, and it does look different. My grandmother lived most of her life legally not being allowed to vote in this country. I will have lived every day of my life with that right. That does not take away from the challenges presented to a Black man during the times I've lived here, but it notes that the struggle and the fight changes, morphs over time. There is progress, and that progress enables a different fight or a different kind of it. And so I think I evaded the answer a little bit, but tried to at least substantively respond in that, look, I still think this is very, very difficult. And I think that progress is a marathon, and we're still very early. Marathon's what, 36 miles, whatever. We're still the first mile.
I have two final questions, and I wanted to, in your work and talking to people and working with other journalists, what would you say is the biggest misconception about this movement, specifically the Black Lives Matter movement? I feel like there's a lot of reporting, different angles on it. What's your take on the misconception about this movement?
So I think there's a few things. I think that and what I'll say is I actually think some of the misconceptions and misperceptions don't matter that much. I'm old enough, I've been covering this long enough that I remember when there was this massive debate about whether or not even the words Black Lives Matter were too divisive. And these activists should pick something else. And why would they say this? Well, this many years later, we're not debating that anymore, right?
Right.
And even the things that today are like, how could they say this? This is such a mistake. But all right, let's fast forward 3 years, and we'll see. We'll see if that's what people still say, right? Again, I think that there's what's hard, I think, for activists of any type, not just activists around issues of racial justice and equity and liberty, but activists in any space, is that they become subject matter experts. They put the work in, they put the reading in, and the average person is just the average person. They haven't done all the reading, they haven't paid attention, and so you get a lot of, well, why haven't you thought of this, or why haven't you done? And it's like, no, we've done that, right? And what I think the core of this argument, of this grapple, of this struggle, of this push and pull is and remains, is this question of is this a system that can be fixed or reformed, or is this a system that has to be, as Kayla Reed said in that quote from my book, burn down and start it over, like trash the whole thing and rebuild it? And I think you'd be very hard pressed to find anyone in the current generation of activists currently doing the work who does not believe you got to basically start this thing over. Because the more time you spend with the criminal justice system, the more you realize the depths of the brokenness of it, and the more you realize the ripple of the impacts of that system. The number of lives ruined with each incarceration, with each wrongful stop, with each wrongful death, the generational trauma passed on because of that, the families and communities broken because of that. And so I think that I do think that we're in a moment where there's a really big push and pull. You've seen a lot of people in the last 5-6 years become supporters, and a lot of white people become supporters. But there's still kind of a debate about what it is they support. How far into it are they? What are they skeptical of? And I think that's going to be one of the defining questions of this moment is what happens there? You've got 5 years ago, you had a lot of people broadly skeptical of this movement in general. Today, you've got the majority of people broadly supporting it, but they aren't quite abolitionists. They aren't quite, well, where might that be in 5 years or 10 years? Where might that be 6 George Floyds from now? And I think that, and I don't know the answer to that. I just know, but I know I don't know the answer to that. I know it's going to change. I know it's going to shift. I know there's going to continue to be movement, and I'm very interested to see what that movement is.
Thank you. I have one final question, and that is the title of my podcast is Rear View Ahead, looking at the past to see what it can teach us about the present and future. And I wanted to read this powerful review of your book by Jelani Cobb of the New Yorker, and he's a professor of journalism at Columbia University. And he says, the best journalism serves as the first draft of history, but every so often a reporter gets to write the second draft as well. Wesley Lowery has provided a crucial dispatch for a particularly American front line. Ferguson, Charleston, Baltimore, and Cleveland are more than flashpoints in current affairs. They are the theaters in which our long-standing battles for racial equality have taken place. They Can't Kill Us is a valuable field report on the status of American democracy itself. And thinking about sort of this draft of history, if you will, what would you say, maybe 5 or 6 years from now, what would you want the lessons, what do you hope the lessons to be from this particular moment in time?
I think that in this moment of time, I think that this last era that we're coming out of provided us a very clear temperature and status of where we are as a country.
Yes.
The day after a multiracial coalition elected a new president and vice president and elected the first Black senator from Georgia and the first Jewish senator from Georgia, a group of white supremacists stormed the Capitol building to prevent the certification of the new presidency. History is going to see that as a white supremacist riot attempting to prevent a major moment of progress in the United States of America. There's a debate over whether or not we will be willing to see it that way in real time. That we are much more generous to ourselves in real time than history will be to ourselves about what's happening in our nation, what's happening in our communities, what's happening across the country. And I think that there's I think that there's something important. I mean, we're just now at the point where mainstream organizations are willing to even engage the idea that issues of race and nativism were major factors and major drivers for the Trump presidency. Well, that's been clear from day one, but there's been a reason we haven't been able to grapple with that. It's a journalistic industry, as talking heads, as whatnot, right? And so again, I think one of the biggest dangers we have is our own delusion sometimes about the realities we're living through. And so what I hope is that when we get out 5 years from now, we will have much more clarity about the moment we have just now gone through. We'll have a willingness to discuss that freely, and hopefully that will inform the way we discuss similar moments moving forward.
Thank you, thank you, thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom, and I really appreciate all that you've said today.
Of course, anytime. Thank you for the work you do.
Thank you.